I used to believe that if you loved your children deeply enough, if you gave them everything you had without keeping score, that love would one day come back to you, not as gratitude or praise, but as presence, as care, as protection when your body grew tired and the world became louder and faster than you could keep up with. I believed that for most of my life. I believed it the way you believe the sun will rise again tomorrow, without question, without fear, and for 79 years nothing had ever challenged that belief. My name is Margaret Lewis, and for more than 4 decades I lived in a small blue house on Maple Street. It wasn't anything special to outsiders, but to me it was everything. That house held my marriage, my children's laughter, my grief, my healing, and eventually my solitude. My husband Henry and I bought it when our children were still small. We planted a maple tree in the front yard, the first spring we lived there, and every autumn, when its leaves turned red, Henry would joke that the tree was trying to outshine the house. After he passed away, that tree became my quiet companion. I talked to it sometimes when no one else was around. It listened better than most people did. After Henry died, the silence in the house became unbearable at first. I would wake up reaching for him, forgetting for a moment that the bed beside me would always be cold. Grief does strange things to time. Days felt long, but years passed quickly. That was when my children started coming around more often. Daniel, my son, and Elaine, my daughter. They checked on me, helped with errands, brought groceries, sat at my table and asked if I was eating properly. I remember feeling grateful, relieved even. I thought perhaps this was the season of life where I would finally be taken care of. At first, their help felt like love. Then slowly, so slowly I didn't notice at first, it began to feel like control. It started with small suggestions. Elaine told me I should stop driving at night because it wasn't safe anymore. Daniel offered to handle my bills so I wouldn't stress myself. They spoke gently, always gently, with concern written all over their faces. I didn't argue. Why would I? These were my children. I had raised them to be kind, responsible adults. I trusted them more than anyone else in the world. I didn't realize how quickly my independence was slipping away. One day my bank card stopped working. Another day my mail didn't arrive. When I asked about it, Daniel told me there must have been a mix-up and that he'd look into it. Elaine reassured me that everything was fine, that I worried too much. I started to doubt myself. That's how it happens, I think. You don't lose your freedom all at once. You lose it piece by piece, until one day you wake up and realize your life no longer belongs to you. The day Elaine brought a stranger into my home without warning is the day I truly began to feel afraid. She introduced him as someone who just needed to ask a few questions. He sat at my dining table with a folder full of papers that had my name printed across the top. At first, the questions were simple. What day is it? Who is the president? Where was I born? I answered easily. Then the questions changed. He asked if I ever felt confused, if I forgot conversations, if I struggled to manage daily tasks. I told him the truth. I lived alone. I cooked my meals. I paid my bills. I knew exactly who I was. He nodded and wrote anyway. When he left, something inside me felt unsettled, like a door had been opened that could not be closed again. A few weeks later, Daniel came over with documents and told me I needed to sign them. He said it was just temporary power of attorney, something responsible families did. I hesitated. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I held the pen. I asked questions. He sighed, the way parents sigh when children don't understand something simple. He told me I didn't fully grasp how these things worked anymore. That sentence hurt more than anything else he could have said. Still, I signed. I didn't want to seem difficult. I didn't want to believe my own children would ever hurt me. After that, everything moved very fast. Suddenly I needed permission to access my own money. I was told certain decisions were no longer mine to make. When I protested, Daniel said they were protecting me. When I asked from what, he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "From yourself." I didn't recognize my own son in that moment. The boy I had held when he cried as a child was gone. In his place stood someone who spoke to me like I was already disappearing. The final blow came on a rainy afternoon when two strangers knocked on my door. They told me they were there because of a court order I knew nothing about. My children had filed to have me declared legally incompetent. They said it calmly, professionally, as if they were discussing a parking violation. I remember sitting down because my legs could no longer hold me. They told me I would not be allowed to leave alone. Arrangements had already been made. My life had been decided without me. My voice hadn't mattered at all. That night I sat alone in the dark, listening to the rain hit the roof, staring at the shadows of the maple tree through the window. I thought of my husband. I thought of the years I had spent defining myself as a mother. I wondered how love could turn into something so cold, so calculated, without ever raising its voice, and I realized, with a fear I cannot properly put into words, that the most dangerous thing my children had done was not taking my money or my home. It was taking my right to be heard. I remember that day with a clarity that has haunted me ever since. The sky was grey, thick clouds pressing down like a warning, though I did not recognize it then. My children arrived at the house, smiling as if everything was ordinary, as if nothing had changed between us. I wanted to believe in their smiles. I wanted to believe that the years of distance, the months of control and subtle intimidation were just misunderstandings that love could smooth over. I opened the door, and there they were, Jason and Kimberly, looking exactly as they always had. Familiar faces I had raised from infancy, yet distant as though strangers had been sewn into their skin. They greeted me politely, almost tenderly, but the warmth I had remembered in their eyes was gone. There was a coldness beneath it, a calculation I couldn't yet name. They told me we were going for a drive. I hesitated, tried to ask questions about where we were going, but their answers were vague. A polite insistence that it would be fun, that I needed a change of scenery, and because I had always trusted them, I allowed myself to be led into the car, my heart beating with a cautious hope that maybe, just maybe, they had begun to care again. As we drove, the familiar streets of my neighborhood gave way to roads I did not recognize. My questions were met with evasions, with calm reassurances, with small laughter that seemed rehearsed. My stomach churned. Something was wrong, though I didn't yet have the words for it. By the time we reached the remote back roads, I understood. The polite smiles and soft voices were masks. Behind them were intentions I had never imagined, intentions so cruel they seemed like something out of a nightmare. They stopped the car. Jason got out first, his movements deliberate, and I saw Kimberly fumble with something long and rough, the edges fraying in the dim light. I froze, understanding dawning too late. They tied me to a pole, and with every loop of rope, with every knot, my heart sank deeper. I remember thinking that this could not be real. My children, the same ones I had nurtured, were doing this to me, leaving me alone, exposed, under the sky that had suddenly turned merciless. I was wet from the rain, my clothes soaked, my hands raw where the ropes cut into my skin. I called out, begged them to stop, reminded them of every small kindness I had shown them. Every night I had stayed awake when they were sick, every meal I had prepared when they were hungry. My voice was weak, but I shouted anyway, hoping they would recognize the person I had been, the mother I had loved them to the very marrow of my bones. Hours passed. The wind stung my cheeks. The rain turned to cold and then to unbearable sun, burning my skin. I do not remember losing hope completely, but I remember the desperation, the sharp, aching fear that this was it, that my life would end tied to that pole, abandoned by the two people I had sacrificed everything for. I could feel every passing second like a small death, and yet, in that terror, a strange clarity came to me. I realized then that love alone would not save me, that sometimes you had to rely on strangers, on the compassion of someone beyond the family you thought you could trust. And as luck, fate, or God would have it, someone did come. Charles Mitchell, a neighbor I barely knew, found me. I remember the relief flooding through me when I saw him, a man who could have walked past and never looked back, but didn't. He knelt beside me, speaking softly, guiding me into his car, wrapping me in warmth and care that I had thought only my children could provide. That day, Charles became more than a rescuer. He became a symbol of what I had lost, yes, but also of what was still possible. Love that was chosen freely, not taken for granted, not held hostage by greed. Those days following the rescue were difficult. I could barely eat, my body ached from the ropes and the exposure, my mind ached from the betrayal, from the knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect me had instead sought to destroy me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, their calm expressions, their smooth, practiced words. Every small kindness they had shown in the past seemed now like part of the trap, a way to ensure my trust, to lull me into believing that they loved me. And yet, in the midst of the grief and the rage, there were small sparks of hope. Charles and his wife Betty were steadfast. They treated me as a human being, not a fragile object to be protected. They let me speak, let me cry, let me be angry without judgment, and slowly, I began to believe that perhaps life could still be lived with dignity. I want to take a moment here, because if you are watching this story, following me through these words, it is because perhaps you too are seeking hope in the darkest of times. I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart, that even when the people who are supposed to love you betray you, even when the world seems cold and indifferent, there is still kindness, there is still compassion, there is still the possibility of rescue. And that is why, if this story moves you, if it gives you even the smallest glimmer of hope, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to this channel. Every time you do, you are helping to spread the message that no one should suffer alone, that survival is possible, and that stories like mine can inspire courage and healing in ways we may never know. The first few nights after returning to Charles and Betty's home, I barely slept. My dreams were filled with the wilderness, the pole, the sun, the wind and their faces, Jason and Kimberly's faces, calm, calculating, unrepentant. But in waking life, I began to notice small things, the gentle hum of the heater, the softness of a blanket, the quiet assurance of people who truly cared. I began to feel safe again, a sensation I hadn't realized I had forgotten. And in that safety, I started to remember who I was, beyond being a mother, beyond being a victim. I was Margaret Lewis, a woman who had survived unimaginable cruelty, and yet still had a life to live, still had choices to make, still had love to give and receive. Charles suggested we go through the events in careful detail, slowly, so that I could recount everything accurately when the time came for the authorities, and eventually the court. At first I was hesitant. Each word I spoke felt like reopening a wound, and each time I cried, I thought I might never stop. But as I told the story, step by step, my memory became an armor. It was proof that I had lived through it, proof that I had felt, endured, and remembered every injustice. My mind became a ledger of truth, my voice a weapon against denial. And I realized then that bravery is not always a grand gesture. Sometimes it is simply refusing to be silenced, refusing to allow your story to be buried. I began to understand, too, that the world outside my pain was vast and unpredictable. There were people who had suffered as I had, who might never speak. There were children who might grow to betray their parents, and parents who might lose hope entirely. And that realization gave me a purpose. My story would not end in the wilderness, tied and broken. It would continue. It would reach others. It would become a beacon. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. No matter how exhausted, no matter how frightened, I would speak the truth. I would share my experience. I would warn others, and I would survive with dignity intact. Even now, as I look back on that period, the memory of that day is sharp, painful, and unrelenting. But alongside it is the memory of the kindness I received, the unwavering support from strangers who became family, the courage that rose within me despite fear, the determination that refused to let me be defined by betrayal. That combination, horror and hope, despair and determination, has shaped every day since. It has reminded me that even when the people closest to you fail, life can still offer redemption, beauty, and love if you are willing to reach out and take it. So I share this story with you, not to relive the trauma, for the sake of spectacle, but to remind anyone who is listening that survival is possible, that betrayal is not the end, and that courage often begins in the quietest moments when no one is watching. And if you take away anything from my words, I hope it is this: never underestimate the power of truth, the power of compassion, and the power of simply telling your story. And again, if my journey moves you, please like, share, and subscribe, because the more these stories are told, the lighter we shine into the dark corners where abuse, neglect, and cruelty try to hide. The days leading up to the trial were among the hardest of my life. Each morning I woke with a knot in my stomach, a heavy weight pressing down on my chest, and a single unrelenting thought: tomorrow I would have to face them. Jason and Kimberly, my own children, sitting across the courtroom, looking like the children I had raised, but acting like strangers who had no trace of the love we once shared. I went over every detail in my mind, the exact sequence of events, every word they had said, every movement that had betrayed their intentions. Charles and Betty were patient with me, letting me repeat the story again and again until the clarity became like armor around my mind. They reminded me gently but firmly that this was not just about me anymore. It was about truth, it was about justice, and it was about preventing anyone else from suffering as I had suffered. When I arrived at the courthouse on the first day, the sheer size of the building made me pause. Its walls were cold, grey, imposing, yet inside there was a pulse, the nervous energy of people waiting, whispering, shuffling papers, trying to maintain control over their emotions. I clutched my coat tightly around me, feeling the ache in my hands, the trembling that never seemed to stop completely. Charles and Betty were by my side, their presence a lifeline. As I walked through the corridors toward the courtroom, I realized that this was the first time in months I had felt the weight of my fear so acutely. But beneath it, there was also a strange sense of resolve. I had survived the wilderness. I had survived the betrayal. I could survive this. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick with anticipation. The judge took his seat, the jury looked on with polite attentiveness, and the prosecutors and defense attorneys positioned themselves like warriors preparing for battle. And then I saw them, Jason and Kimberly. Their faces, calm on the surface, gave nothing away, but my heart recognized the cold calculation beneath their eyes. They had tried to erase me, to silence me, and now I was here, alive and ready to tell the world what they had done. I reminded myself to breathe. Slowly, deeply, I would need every ounce of control I could muster. The trial began with witnesses, people who had been there the day I was abandoned, who had seen my injuries, who had verified the details of my ordeal. Charles testified first, his voice steady, unwavering, recounting the moment he found me in the wilderness, tying his own story of compassion to mine. He spoke of the ropes, the sunburn, the terror etched into my face, the helplessness I had felt. And even as the defense attorney tried to cast doubt, suggesting perhaps I had misinterpreted the situation, Charles remained resolute. His words were a shield, a declaration that what I had experienced was real, and that my memory, my trauma, was not a fragile thing easily dismissed. Then Dr. George took the stand. I watched as he displayed photographs of my injuries, enlarged for the jury to see. The images made my stomach twist, my own eyes filling with tears, but I stayed seated, holding myself together. My wrists were cut and raw, my skin burned, bruises marking where the ropes had pressed into me. Dr. George spoke with authority about the duration of my exposure, the severity of my injuries, the physical evidence that confirmed what had happened. The jury flinched, some leaning forward as if trying to absorb the horror I had lived through. It was validating, a confirmation that I had not imagined this, that my suffering was real, undeniable. When my turn came, I felt my legs trembling as I rose to the stand. Charles squeezed my hand once, letting go, and I walked forward, each step heavy with fear and determination. The oath was administered, my hand resting on the Bible, and I spoke the words I had rehearsed in the quiet of my room countless times. I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. The words rang out, stronger than I expected, echoing in the courtroom like a promise. The district attorney began gently, asking me to tell my story, to recount who I was, my relationship with my children, the life we had shared before things began to change. I spoke of the laughter, the small victories, the birthdays celebrated, the nights spent nursing them through fevers, the sacrifices my husband and I had made so they could have a better life. I spoke of the growing distance over the years, the calls that became fewer, the visits that were hurried, the subtle hints that love alone was no longer enough to hold them nearby. My voice shook at times, but I did not stop. Every tear, every tremor was part of the truth. Then came the difficult part, recounting the day I was left in the wilderness. I closed my eyes, remembering the knots, the ropes cutting into my wrists, the hot sun, the endless fear. I spoke of the moment Jason took control, Kimberly's cruel words, the realization that my children had decided I was no longer valuable to them. I begged them, I said, my voice catching. I reminded them of every happy memory, every act of love I had given. And they ignored me. They left me to suffer, to die, as if all the years of care I had given were meaningless. The courtroom was silent except for my voice. Some jurors had tears in their eyes. One older woman, sitting alone near the back, openly wept, and I felt a strange, quiet solidarity with her, as though she understood the depths of betrayal that one could endure from the very people meant to protect you. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense lawyer tried to shake my resolve, asking me rapid questions, trying to plant doubt. He asked if I had misinterpreted my children's intentions, if perhaps I had been confused or mistaken. I looked directly at him, then at the jury, and said firmly, "No, there is no possibility of that. I know exactly what happened that day. My memory is clear. My fear was real. My children left me to die, and I am here to tell the truth." Every word felt like lifting a stone from my chest, a small piece of freedom reclaimed. Throughout the testimony, Charles and Betty were there, offering silent encouragement, their presence reminding me that family was not only blood. Harper, too, was there, holding my hands during the most difficult moments, her eyes steady and filled with belief. I realized then that love is not always inherited. Sometimes it is chosen, and in that courtroom I found strength in the people who had chosen me, who had not turned away when I was in need. By the time the first day of testimony ended, I was physically and emotionally drained, but there was a quiet satisfaction, a knowledge that I had stood for myself, that I had spoken for every person who had been silenced, who had suffered in secret, who had been left to wonder if anyone would believe them. That night, back at Charles and Betty's home, I sat with a cup of tea, the warmth grounding me as I reflected on the day. "You were incredible," Betty said, placing her hand over mine. "The jury saw your courage. They saw the truth." And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps justice could be more than a hope. Perhaps it could be a reality. The trial continued in the following days. Witnesses corroborated my story. Experts, friends, neighbors, medical professionals, each adding a layer of credibility, each dismantling the narrative my children's defense sought to build. And every time I spoke, every time I recalled details that no one else could, I felt the chains of fear loosen slightly. My voice became my weapon, my truth a shield. And in sharing my story, I began to understand that the trial was not just about punishment. It was about recognition. Recognition that my life had value, that the love I had given was real, and that cruelty could not erase the truth. I want to pause here to speak directly to you, whoever you are, listening to my story unfold. If you're moved, if you feel the weight of my words, if you recognize the courage it takes to stand and tell the truth, I ask that you support this channel. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need hope, and subscribe. By doing so, you help ensure that stories like mine are heard, that the message reaches those who are suffering in silence, and that the truth can have a voice in the world. Every action matters. Every like, every share, every subscription spread courage and light into a world that can sometimes feel overwhelmingly dark. The weeks of trial were exhausting. Each day I returned home with my body aching, my mind full of memories I wished I could forget, but my heart swelling with a strange resilience. I began to see something I had long forgotten: the power of justice when it is wielded not with vengeance, but with unwavering truth. And as the day approached when the jury would deliberate, I realized something profound. I was no longer the same woman who had been tied to that pole. I had become a witness to my own strength, a voice for every person who had been silenced, and a survivor whose life could not be stolen by greed or cruelty. The days waiting for the jury's decision felt longer than any day I had ever lived. Each morning I woke with a tightness in my chest, a quiet dread that I could not shake, and the persistent thought, what if they don't believe me? Charles and Betty tried to soothe my fears, reminding me gently that I had spoken the truth, that every detail I had given was backed by evidence, by photographs, by witnesses who had seen my suffering firsthand. But even their reassurances could not erase the knot of anxiety that had. Finally, on the second day of deliberations, my phone rang. Charles answered it, his voice tense but steady, and then he looked at me, eyes wide, a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. "Martha," he said softly, "the jury has reached a verdict. You need to be in court in 30 minutes. I nodded, feeling my legs tremble as if they had forgotten how to walk. Charles and Betty guided me through the familiar streets to the courthouse, their presence a constant anchor. Inside, the courtroom was packed, reporters leaning forward with pens poised, cameras aimed, the air buzzing with anticipation. My children sat at the defense table, pale and tense, their carefully constructed facades cracking ever so slightly under the weight of reality. When the judge entered and the jury was called back into the room, silence fell over the courtroom. Every sound seemed magnified. The shuffle of papers, the creak of the wooden benches, the steady breathing of people waiting for the moment that would change lives. I gripped Charles's hand tightly, drawing strength from his quiet presence, and for the first time in weeks I allowed myself a small, cautious hope. The jury foreman rose, a middle-aged man with glasses, his expression unreadable, and spoke the words that would finally confirm the truth I had been living in every cell of my being. "Yes, Your Honor." The charges were read, one by one, and with each declaration of guilt, a piece of the fear that had haunted me for months dissolved. On the charge of attempted first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. My legs nearly gave way, but Charles held me steady. On the charge of kidnapping, guilty. On the charge of elder abuse, guilty. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, some whispers of relief, some quiet sobs. I sat back in my chair, a wave of exhaustion and validation washing over me. My children had faced the consequences of their actions. The betrayal that had haunted me for so long was met with justice, and for the first time in months I allowed myself to breathe freely. The sentencing was scheduled 3 weeks later, and those days stretched before me like a bridge to freedom. I spent the time with Charles, Betty, and Harper, walking in the parks near their home, baking bread, and allowing myself to enjoy the ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible. The world seemed softer, kinder, and yet the memory of the wilderness, of the ropes cutting into my wrists, of the sun burning my skin, lingered as a reminder of the life I had survived. When the day of sentencing finally arrived, the courtroom was again filled to capacity, the air thick with expectation. I took my seat, holding my head high, ready to speak if allowed. When the judge called for victim impact statements, I stood. Every eye in the courtroom turned to me, some curious, some sympathetic, and I felt the weight of all the months, all the pain, all the fear, concentrated into a single unwavering voice. I spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting the love I had given my children, the sacrifices I had made, the cruelty I had endured. My voice wavered as I described the day I was left to die, the terror, the hopelessness, the feeling of being discarded like an object rather than a human being. And then, with a steadiness I did not know I possessed, I turned to face them, Jason and Kimberly, the two people who had once been my children. "You left me in the wilderness to die," I said, my voice calm, controlled, as if my life, my love, my sacrifices meant nothing. What is most painful is not the suffering you caused me physically, but the realization that you were capable of that cruelty. My words hung in the courtroom like smoke, filling every corner with truth. Kimberly sobbed openly. Jason kept his head bowed, silent. I did not look away, because this was my moment, my voice reclaiming the power that had been stolen from me. I spoke of the life I had rebuilt, the family I had chosen, the community that had embraced me. I asked the judge to impose the most severe sentence permitted by law, not for revenge, but to make clear that the lives of the elderly have value, that love and respect cannot be discarded for greed. The judge listened, solemn and stern, and then announced the sentence. 20 years for attempted first-degree murder, 5 additional years for kidnapping, 3 additional years for elder abuse, all to be served consecutively. The court was silent but heavy with the weight of justice, the realization that what I had endured had been acknowledged and met with the consequences it deserved. As the bailiffs escorted my children out, I felt a strange release. It was not joy exactly, but relief, a sense that the chapter of fear, betrayal, and helplessness had ended. The sun shone through the tall courthouse windows, and for the first time in months, I felt the warmth of the world, the proof that life, though scarred, could continue, could flourish. Outside, reporters crowded around, eager for a statement. I had prepared my words carefully. I spoke slowly, clearly, my voice carrying across the throng. Justice has been served, but there is no victory here, only a reminder that love and respect for our elders are sacred. Cherish those who care for you, honor those who raised you, and let greed never cloud your humanity. Walking back to Charles's car, I realized that the ordeal had changed me. I was no longer the woman who had begged for scraps of affection. I was stronger, wiser, and fully aware that family is not determined solely by blood, but by care, loyalty, and love. And as the car drove back through the town streets, I felt the sun on my face, the wind in my hair, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. I knew the journey of healing would continue, that scars would remain, but I also knew that the wilderness, the betrayal, the pain, none of it had the power to define the rest of my life. My story was my own, and I would continue it on my terms. The days after the sentencing were filled with a quiet, almost surreal sense of liberation. For the first time in years, I felt that the world was not a place to fear, that I could walk freely without the shadow of my children's cruelty looming over every step. Charles, Betty, and Harper were my constant companions, but more importantly, they were a living testament to what it meant to care for someone truly, selflessly, without expectation. We spent mornings tending gardens, afternoons baking bread and pastries, evenings telling stories under the soft glow of lamps, and nights on the porch, staring at the stars and feeling the comforting continuity of life. The town that had once been just a place on the map had become my home in the truest sense. Neighbors waved from their porches, children ran up to greet me by name, and families invited me to share meals, stories, and laughter. I had become, in many ways, a grandmother to dozens of children, a mentor and a friend to adults who had known only hardship. I found that my heart, once bruised and cautious, could still open and expand, not because the past had been erased, but because I had chosen to fill it with goodness, compassion, and purpose. I volunteered at the community center, teaching cooking classes, showing young people the recipes and traditions that had been passed down to me from my mother. Each lesson was more than just about food. It was about patience, love, and the care we give to others, lessons that felt especially meaningful after all I had endured. One afternoon, I received a letter that moved me deeply. It was from a woman in her mid-60s who had been enduring years of emotional abuse at the hands of her own daughter. She wrote to tell me that my story had inspired her to seek help, to remove herself from a toxic situation she'd once felt powerless to escape. Her words, full of gratitude and newfound hope, reminded me that my suffering had not been in vain. Each letter, each message from strangers who had found courage through my survival, strengthened the conviction that the darkest chapters of our lives can indeed be transformed into beacons for others. It was a reminder that even in the depths of despair, purpose can emerge, and the pain we endure can be repurposed for good. Years passed, each one layered with growth, joy, and peace. I celebrated my 83rd birthday with the town, the streets, and square filled with people who had become my family in every way that mattered. Music, laughter, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. Charles and Betty organized everything, ensuring that every detail reflected the warmth and care that had defined my new life. Friends, neighbors, students from my classes, children I had read to, now teenagers and young adults, all gathered to honor the life I had reclaimed. I realized in that moment that the family I had once believed lost to greed and cruelty had been replaced by a family chosen for love and respect. They were bloodless, yes, but bound by shared lives, shared kindness, and shared humanity. Even as the years moved forward, I remained acutely aware of the passage of time. I turned 85, then 88, and finally 90, each birthday marked by gratitude for the life I had survived to lead. My hair had become silver as snow, my face lined by both sorrow and joy, and my steps slower but no less determined. I continued my work at the community center, volunteering at the soup kitchen, mentoring young people, and speaking at events to raise awareness about elder abuse. Invitations came from all over the country, sometimes from faraway cities, sometimes from organizations that had learned of my story and sought my voice to inspire change. Each invitation was a testament to the reach of resilience, to the power of survival turned into advocacy. One day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a newly published book on elder abuse, which had extensively used my story as a case study. There was a note from the author expressing gratitude for my bravery, for having spoken out when so many remained silent. I placed the book carefully on the shelf next to my Bible and photographs of my chosen family as a reminder that what had happened in the wilderness and in the courtroom had not defined the limits of my life. It had, in fact, expanded it, filled it with purpose, and created a legacy of hope for others who might one day need courage to stand for themselves. Letters continued to arrive, stories of seniors finding the strength to leave abusive situations, adult children learning to value their parents before it was too late, communities starting conversations about respect and dignity for the elderly. Each letter was a thread weaving a tapestry of change, and I felt a quiet pride, a satisfaction that the worst of experiences could give rise to the best of outcomes. My life, once nearly extinguished by betrayal, had become a vessel for transformation, not only for myself, but for countless others who would read, hear, or witness my journey. My biological children, Jason and Kimberly, remained in prison. Kimberly had written once a letter of apology and attempted redemption. I read it, placed it carefully in a drawer, and chose not to respond. My heart had no space for a relationship that had been destroyed beyond repair. Jason never wrote. Their choices, their greed, their cruelty had cost them the lives they might have lived outside prison. I did not rejoice in their punishment, but I accepted it as the natural consequence of their actions. My life was no longer tethered to their reckoning. I had my freedom, my dignity, my peace. Even now, as I sit on my porch, watching the sun rise over the town that welcomed me, I feel the gentle rhythm of life surrounding me. The air is filled with bird song. The aroma of fresh bread wafts from my kitchen. Children's laughter drifts from the nearby playground. And I know that this is where I am meant to be. I am no longer the woman who measured her worth by her children's affection. I am the woman who has survived, who has loved, and who has chosen joy in spite of sorrow. I have discovered that true family is not defined by blood, but by how we care for one another, how we honor and protect each other, and how we build bonds of trust, kindness, and compassion. As the night falls and stars appear in the sky, I remember that long ago evening in the wilderness when I thought my life had ended, and I marvel at the journey I have taken. The fear, the pain, the betrayal, they are still part of me, yes, but they are no longer the story I tell myself. They are the crucible through which my strength and resilience were forged. I have seen what cruelty can do, but I have also seen what love, compassion, and courage can create. I have chosen the latter, and in doing so I have found peace, and so I live each day intentionally, surrounded by the people who chose me, who value me, who celebrate life with me. My story has become more than a tale of survival. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the transformative power of kindness, and the enduring truth that even when life is darkest, it can be reshaped into a life of meaning, love, and profound joy. I have lost 2 children, but I have gained an entire world of family. My story does not end in the wilderness, in the courtroom, or in the pain inflicted upon me. My story continues every day I wake, every meal I share, every hand I hold, every life I touch. And in that I have found what I always needed: peace, love, and the freedom to live fully, without fear, without regret, and with a heart that is open to all the goodness the world still holds.